Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Homer's Odyssey Explained. Imagine no religion. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. L.P. Hartley, The Go-Between. When one encounters the word religion in a translation of an ancient text, first, cross out the word whenever it occurs. Next, find a copy of the text in question in its original language and see what word, if any, is being translated by religion. Third, come up with a different translation. It almost doesn't matter what, anything besides religion. Edwin Judge. Hi everybody, and I want to pick up where we left off with the reading of Odysseus, which I'm going to return to in the next video, hopefully in 2 or 3 days. But I finished with the introduction of Athena in the guise of Mentes, beginning to, as the Mentes implies mentor, she began to give advice to Telemachus, the son of Odysseus. And that made me think, before I wanted to do any more readings, I wanted to get behind the concept of what it was, what the Greeks understood by the notion of the gods with a small g, and oppose that to the concept of the monotheistic god with a capital G of some of the world's major religions. And it's an interesting exercise because throughout this talk, it's nominally about religion, but the point being, the ancient Greek, and to some extent the Roman, which I'll allude to, but the ancient Greek understanding of religion, we use the word religion, but they just didn't have that type of understanding. And it goes to, the broader issue of this talk is all about how you even begin to understand what happened in past times, given the language we use and the concepts we use within that language sometimes don't even begin to approximate the concepts that people in ancient times would have been using and how their worldview, how they saw the world. But we kid ourselves. And rather than see that as a bad thing, the idea that we can't necessarily fully describe accurately how those people thought or use words in the same way they did, the main thrust of today's talk is that if you read literature, one of its major strengths is it encourages you to embrace the unknown, the uncertainty, different epochs, different eras, the fact that we'll never fully understand what it was like to be an ancient Greek person, even if you think you might. It's just those not only are those days gone, but that whole way of thinking is irretrievable. It's part of this unknown. And that, to me, is part of the appeal of literature. It reminds you of what can't be known. Whereas science, as I'll allude to as we go along, or I'll describe, is almost the exact opposite. It's this idea that everything can be described, everything can be quantified, everything can be put into a formula. And literature in the form of Homer, as you can see in the Odyssey, isn't about that. And I want to explore, so that this imagine no religion is one of my compatriots, John Lennon. I'll resist the temptation to sing. I used to do a mean karaoke. Only 2 songs I could sing were Elvis, Suspicious Minds, and Neil Diamond, Sweet Caroline. And I can honestly say I made grown men cry. And I'll leave you to guess whether it was tears of joy or aural pain, I should say. Oral pain would be something different. Quickly moving on. So this difference in gods with a small g and gods with a capital G. Got myself banned off YouTube before I even began. But this picture is obviously a well, not obviously, you may not know what it's about, but it's obviously a statue. It's a statue of Athena guiding Odysseus. And where we left off in the when I began to read from the actual text, which I'm going to be returning to very shortly in a couple of days, 2 or 3 days. But I wanted to get behind this concept of where we finished was Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, being guided by mentees, or mentored, as the name gives us, by the goddess Athena. And it began to introduce the concept of what did they think was happening when the gods came down to earth. And it's interesting that what Athena manages to persuade Telemachus is to basically, I'm trying to think of a polite way you put it, the vernacular would be, or the colloquial expression would be, grow up, become a man. He's on the edge of becoming legally a man, and she encourages him basically to develop a name for himself in the outside world and to look for information about his father. Interestingly, though, that is what he would do probably anyway. So Athena, in that sense, represents what a young man in his position might do, what he might be thinking, what his instincts might be. So immediately you can see the notion of the gods as a personification, as a projection of emotions, rather than our today's notion, our contemporary idea of God with a capital G, as this omnipotent, all-powerful being to whom we are subordinate. The Greeks had a much different idea. The gods were, I'll repeat the phrase, but they were projections of human qualities, but they were projected into this strange past, the past that, what by definition was no more, but was somewhere else. And it wasn't just the chronological, going back in time chronologically as we do in our notions of when history was, because these were non-historical times that just represented what could no longer be imagined. And I want to develop that idea. I think within Western culture we have this notion that history can be measured a bit like archaeology, and you can, there are divisible eras and epochs of time, and you can measure human culture like that. The point I want to explore today is, what if the past is a foreign country? They do things differently there. What if we will never ever be able to fully imagine what it would be like to live in those times? And rather than that be a bad thing, rather than seek to then successfully prove or record or find ways to reproduce what it was like to be in those days, except with good grace that we'll never fully know. And the fact we can't know, and the fact it's unknowable, is actually what makes literature that gives us hints about what it might have been like and how people thought differently to us. How that is what makes art brilliant and enjoyable and fascinating, and it can never be fully known. And I guess some people who are more drawn to science find that off-putting. I'd argue it's what makes art the amazing thing that it is. That it can touch the knowable, but often it's enigmatic, it's ambiguous by its very nature, and that isn't something to be shied away from. That's something to actually be embraced. So this is where we left off in the previous reading from Book 1, Part 1. We were approximately halfway through Book 1. So I'm only going to give this text, and then I'm going to give more background, and then I'm going to return to the reading in a couple of days. Still, the clear-eyed goddess, in other words Athena, reassured him, "Trust me, the gods have not marked out your house for such an unsung future. Not if Penelope has borne a son like you. But tell me about all this, and spare me nothing. What's this banqueting, this crowd carousing here? And what part do you play yourself? Some wedding feast? Some festival? Hardly a potluck supper, I would say. How obscenely they lounge and swagger here. Look, gorging in your house. Why, any man of sense who chanced among them would be outraged seeing such behaviour." I'll return to the concept of the wedding feast, because that's very relevant towards the very end of the 24 books. I think it's book 20. Is it book 23? But Odysseus basically sits down with Penelope, and it's almost like they're newlyweds. They don't look at each other, and he's been bathed ceremonially, and it's almost like they're getting married for the first time, even though they've been married for decades. Admittedly, he's been away for 20 years. But the epic starts with these suitors eating Penelope out of house and home, and it ends with almost like them becoming married again, so that this notion of a wedding feast ties the whole epic together. But in this instance, it's used by Athena to, I'm trying to think of a more pretentious way to say it. She's just trying to wind up Telemachus. She's trying to get inside his head and basically push him out like a mother bird, pushing him out the nest. Go and make your name, go and find some renown, Kleos, and avenge your father if possible. You should be outraged, she's saying to him. And what I want to explore today is the way in which a god with a small g like this talking to Telemachus in disguise is, in another disguise, arguably a projection of human emotions. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, gave these gods human characteristics because they represented themselves human characteristics. And it's no coincidence, therefore, that someone like Freud would go to the Greek myths to find names like, the Oedipal complex and all these, the Electra complex, all these phrases he had to try and understand human psychology. I think it's all in the epics and the Greek mythology. And in that sense, they're very unlike the God with a capital G that we're used to in Western Christianity in particular, also in Islam, Judaism, this one God who in lots of ways is, because he's omnipotent, is obviously not human, doesn't share human characteristics, but these gods squabble amongst themselves. They come down to earth and visit and interfere in human affairs. And that makes them very amenable to be seen as projections of human emotions. So one aspect of that would be, I'm just going to name a couple of books before I focus on one particular book. And I intend to look at this particular book in more detail in future. But The Greeks and the Irrational by E.R. Dodds, and from memory, I think it was written it was based on some lectures he gave, and I think it's the 1950s, unless I've misremembered. And I find it a brilliant book because it really does convey this idea. Recently I've done a video or two on the philosophy of mind and the psychological aspects of what it is, to how the human brain works, from the intersection of philosophy of mind and recent neuroscience. And when you look at that very contemporary modern stuff, I think Thomas Metzinger was one of the people I looked at. But when you look back at theories of the Greek myths, the way E.R. Dodds here, he looks at how they represented concepts of the irrational. So they had notions of daemons, spirits that inhabited them momentarily. So if they lost self-control, they'd blame it on a daemon. But it wasn't, the demon wasn't, you could use them as partially as an excuse, but the Greeks were always interested in outcomes, not intentions. So you could use the daemon to explain why you did something, but that wasn't an excuse. You still did it. And it was I was going to say primitive form of psychology, but actually the more you get into it, the more interesting it becomes and the more layered and subtle. So I think, is that ate, ate, the Greek word they used to mean a temporary clouding or bewildering of normal consciousness. So a sudden outbreak of irrationality in someone, it was given a term, and they engaged with these ideas. And in the instance where I've just given you, where Athena comes down and acts as a mentor to Telemachus, she almost works, that I think the closest emotional psychological condition you'd think of is Athena works as growing recognition in Telemachus's personality, or a growing sense of intuition that he should go out, make a name for himself and look for his father. So it's portrayed as an external force coming in, but actually you could interpret Athena talking to Telemachus as a psychological growing self-awareness in Telemachus himself. And this is why the gods with a small g become really interesting, because the Greeks use them as a way to understand what can't be fully known, the irrational, what can't be known within our psyches, but is nevertheless a way of modeling how the brain or how human emotions work. This is another brilliant book that I will look at as we go through the Odyssey in more detail. But it's obviously a rhetorical title. Did the Greeks believe in their myths? Because I think lazily modern Western readers might assume that they, of course they did. But actually, the concept of belief is much more layered than that. And at the beginning of this book, I think he describes it's a tribe in Ethiopia called the Dorze, and they have a mythical belief that all animals are Christian. I think they're Coptic Christians. And the book starts with this idea that the Coptic Christians, the Dorze in Ethiopia, believe that the leopard won't attack their animals on a feast day because it's a Christian animal, but nevertheless they don't leave their animals unguarded or unsafe. So that it's simultaneously they believe something, but in practical terms, do they? But they're quite comfortable with this simultaneous belief and yet practical behavior at the same time. So it's not an either or. It's not a very simplistic you believe or you don't believe, and if you believe something you act in a certain way. They play both sides at the same time, which you can interpret as more primitive or more sophisticated depending on your perspective. Another example would be, I think Slavoj Žižek gives it in his work about children believing in Christmas. If you think of children believing in Christmas, it's up to a certain age, very young kids, you can give them this myth that Father Christmas comes down the chimney, he brings the presents with his reindeers and so on. But what happens is, after a relatively short period of time, your siblings tell you, as it would happen in my case, I busily told my younger sibling to ruin the myth. But at a quite relatively young age, most kids actually know the truth. So, or they wake up in the middle of the night and see their parent putting their presents at the bottom of the bed or whatever. So there's only a limited time when very naive, innocent kids actually do believe in Father Christmas. But sometimes kids continue to pretend to believe because they get a sense their parents want them to. And then beyond that, there's also the idea that some parents want to believe their kids believe in Father Christmas because they need to believe in the children's belief. So the belief has layers. And this works also in Greek myth. So there's this idea, I think we'll come across a phrase shortly, where Vane talks about a Greek put the gods in heaven, but he would be astounded to see them in the sky. So it's one thing to nominally believe that the gods are up there in the heavens, but if you saw Athena floating in the sky with her shield and helmet, then you'd be freaked out. So belief has these layers of simultaneous actual investment in a certain way of thinking that's concomitant with not literally believing, and the literally not believing literally, and the investment, emotional and psychological, in a certain way of thinking that has side benefits. These are imbricated or interwoven in quite subtle ways that are quite psychologically useful, as we'll explore in a second. But most essentially, this, I mentioned earlier, this idea of the chronology of time, but the idea that these heroes and gods are from another unknown time. And that's fine. Instead of trying to think of history as this findable place because it's just a projected, measurable, chronological length of the passage of time before you could say that's when such and such a thing happened. The Greek myths portray this unknown time, or this time of heroes and gods, which you might think is fanciful and fictional, but in lots of practical ways, yes, you could say that 2,000 years ago X, Y, and Z happened, but it's not within our actual realm of experience. We can intellectually know it was 2,000 years ago, but it's not something we can actually, to any significant extent, put ourselves in the place of people who lived 2,000 years ago and genuinely even begin to understand how they felt and lived their lives. You can read lots of history, you can read lots of social history, but it's not the same. They may as well have been living in Greek mythical times for all that we genuinely know how they thought and felt. And I came across this phrase, the Greek myths as a kind of lethargy, and I'll give you the full context to that. They took place earlier during the heroic generations when the gods still took part in human affairs. Mythical space and time was secretly different from our own. A Greek put the gods in heaven, but he would have been astounded to see them in the sky. I think that's just a great sentence. A Greek put the gods in heaven, but he would have been astounded to see them in the sky. So the actual sky is not the same as the concept of the heavens. He would have been no less astounded if someone, using time in its literal sense, told him that Hephaestus had just remarried or that Athena had aged a great deal lately. Then he would have realised that in his own eyes, mythic time had only a vague analogy with daily temporality. He would also have thought that a kind of lethargy had always kept him from recognising this difference. And it's a kind of lethargy, I think it's a wonderful way of expressing how ancient people didn't beat themselves up over trying to chronologically go back with exact measurements of time. They just recognised it was a different place, a different experience that was no longer available. So, in that sense, you can think of the Greek myths as a very workable way of dealing with the issue that human beings can't genuinely relate to vast periods of time beyond their direct experience. The myths translate in a way that unknowability of the past into something that can be known and communicated amongst each other. And that reminded me, we're doing on the channel, a long read of Proust in Search of Lost Time, La Recherche du Temps Perdu, in a remembrance of things past. And it's a vaguely similar thing, although the protagonist Marcel is looking back on his own lifetime. It's not a scientific chronology. It's much more Marcel thinking about his own childhood almost as if it was lived by a different person because it seems so distant and far away, whilst yet still also intimate and personally experienced. So the analogy between these temporal worlds disguises their hidden plurality. It's not self-evident that humanity has a past, known or unknown. One does not perceive the limit of the centuries held in memory any more than one perceives the line bounding the visual field. One does not see the obscure centuries stretching beyond this horizon. One simply stops seeing, and that is all. The heroic generations are found on the other side of this temporal horizon, in another world. And it might sound counterintuitive, but what I'm arguing is, in some ways, the Greek way of developing myths in order to make sense of past time that goes beyond their direct experience is in some ways more sensible and more useful than our mistaken belief that you can learn a load of historical facts and even read the texts of past times from many hundreds of years ago and somehow still understand in any meaningful sense or ultimately meaningful sense what those people felt and how they directly experience their lives. I'm not denying, of course, you can have an approximation. We can read the Odyssey and it still affects us. But I think it's a massive mistake to think we can truly, fully ever understand it. And it's a bigger mistake to think that our failure to understand it and the fact that aspects of it will always be unknown to us is a bad thing. I'm advocating that we embrace the unknown in that sense. And this is just another example. So this is from Hesiod, who was, they don't know the exact dates. They think Homer was perhaps older, but they're generally viewed as contemporaries, Hesiod and Homer. So the theogonia in Greek, but the theogony, and this is the proem, the epigrammatic summary at the beginning. It was the Muses who taught me, Hesiod, their beautiful song. It happened when I was tending flocks of sheep in a valley of Helicon, that holy mountain. And the very first thing that the goddesses said to me, those muses of Mount Olympus, those daughters of Zeus, who holds the Aegis, was this wording: shepherds camping in the fields, base objects of reproach, mere bellies. We know how to say many deceptive things, looking like genuine things, but we also know how, whenever we wish it, to proclaim things that are true, aletheia. And it's just interesting if you think of the Christian tradition whereby the angels of the Lord appeared to shepherds to announce the coming of Christ. It's interesting that Hesiod's describing himself as a shepherd, and the muses, the voices of the gods. So I think the name Hesiodos means he who sends forth the voice. And remember, the muses are basically the voices of the gods. And in my notes here it says the element odos, voice of Hesiodos, is apparently cognate with aude, voice, meaning voice in Greek, what was breathed into Hesiod by the muses. But notice I've emboldened it right from the get-go, and this is why I think the Greeks, in lots of ways, if you think of your average contemporary person who's excessively literal-minded, I'll talk shortly about, and in future, about the notion of we actually view science in actually quite a mythical way. We impute so much power to it, even though the average person has relatively little scientific knowledge. Science, arguably, to us is like the gods were to the ancient Greeks, except the ancient Greeks were more nuanced and subtle, because as you can see here, they knew that to the extent they knew about the gods or the gods' purposes, sometimes they'd have aletheia, they'd know things that were true, but also the muses knew how to say many deceptive things. So there is no ultimate truth, there is no objective truth. You're going to be told stories, and elements will be true and elements will be deceptive. And guess what? That's life. That's what you have to deal with. And that type of inevitable ambiguity that we can never escape, that is what the to some extent the myths encapsulated. So the book I'm going to draw on mostly for the rest of this talk is this Imagine No Religion. And I've just made the point actually in a clumsy way, but the subtitle, How Modern Abstractions Hide Ancient Realities. We abstract away from the particular, so we might think the myths are overly particular, they're too descriptive of things that couldn't possibly be known. But the argument I'm making is that the Greeks knew that these things couldn't be known, but they gave them form nevertheless in mythical stories. But within those stories, as you've just seen from Hesiod, is the acknowledgement that those stories are partially true and partially deceptive. But you never know which half is deceptive and which half is true. And that's a metaphor for how we engage with life as human beings. So in this book, Barton and Boyarin, they contrast. There's the Roman, which is I'm not going to talk too much about because obviously we're talking about the Greeks with reference to Homer. But religio, the notion of the Roman word that we use the word religion for, But more interestingly, the Greeks had this concept of threskeia, which was the word that we would say meant religion. But the whole book, Imagine No Religion, is exploring how both for the Romans and the Greeks, religion doesn't fully describe what they meant by the practices that were labeling as religion. There's this reductive translation. We need to find a phrase to impose upon their customs. And Barton and Boyarin say it just doesn't work. The more you look into it, we're doing what we do with science. We're abstracting and finding things that can be controlled. But actually, it's not. It may be useful because it gives you a sense that you're in control and that you're in power of the situation. But actually, labeling what went on in ancient times by our label religion disguises as much as it explains. That's the major thrust of their book. And one of the arguments that's really interesting in it is they make the point that to some extent the Iliad and the Odyssey are the hinge point. They were oral traditions. They were, peripatetic traveling storytellers. And the minute it was put into text, arguably marks this change in society from a society that the gods played a strong, powerful, structuring role in, and especially with the role of Odysseus, who whilst obedient to the gods, shows cunning, shows human independence. It marks the beginning of Greek culture's move away from a clan-based society. So remember, the Odyssey starts in Ithaca, in this lord's home. He's called a king, but basically there are many kings in the area. They're basically lords. And it's a society based upon the notion of shame and honour. And as Greek society evolves, and arguably within the Odyssey itself, you can see how things are changing to a society based more upon guilt and obedience. And Odysseus in particular represents personal initiative. So the overarching framework, the gods are still there, the clan system is still there, but increasingly Odysseus comes to represent the rise of individualism. And when you get to later on past the Greeks to the Romans, they had their myths of foundation, Romulus and Remus and so on. But increasingly it stopped being warlike clans, and Roman society became more and more abstract and a more civil society, a bit more like a modern polity, a modern political structure compared to the old clan system. So I made the point earlier about we think we understand, and this idea that actually maybe we're separated by language. We think because we have language, we think because we can read the Odyssey and the Iliad, we can learn about Greek culture, and of course we can. But also there's a false equivalence. I've talked in other videos about the role of translation, and the point is you can never translate fully between one language and another. The idioms, the unique modes of expression within a particular language can never be fully translated because they're unique to that language. Languages contain within themselves a unique worldview that's based upon the unique history of the culture that gave rise to that language. So I do think it's an interesting idea. We always think of language as a unifying, explanatory vehicle. But in this book, Imagine No Religion, it's actually pointed that pointed towards the idea that, well, maybe language separates as much as it explains. So they say, while there have been some researchers who've striven, I like the gorilla example, who have striven to bring the gorilla into our world and teach her sign language so that she might live with us and communicate with us in our terms. We aspire to be like those researchers who've been willing to submerge themselves in the lives and languages of the gorillas in the hope of learning a very different way of understanding and negotiating the world. So I'm sure you've seen on television that the gorillas or monkeys that they teach sign language to. And they're making the counterintuitive point I think is quite interesting. Yeah, there's some type of communication going on between the gorillas and us. But it's not the same as if you went in and lived and managed to speak gorilla language. So I'm sorry if it's an obvious point, but it just intrigues me, this idea that the very thing, the sign language that makes us think we're communicating with gorillas, is actually no, it's just making, I was going to use the term, makes the gorilla ape our behavior, our language, but then it becomes less of a real gorilla. It's a gorilla who's doing things that bring it closer to humankind, but arguably further away from its natural gorillaness, if that's a phrase. So it's a long-winded way of saying language is double-edged. It both separates us from reality. So, for example, if you use the word tree, it allows you to describe a concept. But the minute you use the word tree, you're abstracting away from the unique features of the tree you're describing. And that's the subtitle of this book, How Modern Abstractions Hide Ancient Realities. And I think the ancients were wise enough to realize, yes, we've got language, yes, we can describe things, yes, Plato can write these profound philosophical tracts, but there's also the myths, and Greek culture evolved and got further and further away from the myths. But for all through the Golden Age, the Greek tragedies and the Greek myths still played an important part in making the Greeks appreciate the power. The very failure of language to describe everything is also the power of language to describe something. And it's a very powerful vehicle for describing ultimately unknowable human emotions, but nevertheless, myths and the tragedies of the Greek Golden Age, they still bring us closer to real knowledge of what it is to be human. A bit like going back to the gorilla troop and actually, or pride, whatever the collective noun is for a load of gorillas. It's not going to be just sign language that will allow you to understand what goes on in a gorilla's mind. Just like it won't be Plato's philosophy that allows you to fully understand what it was like to live in ancient Greece. Maybe I'm mixing metaphors badly, but I think the Greek tragic plays and the Greek myths are much closer to going back to the gorilla world and getting a better sense of what the gorillas were experiencing and what their culture was like. So there's this concept of separation by language across eras is just a intractable, really, for me, an absolutely fascinating area. So Goldilocks and the Pax Romana, I'll explain this, but when the Greeks referred to the concept of Thraiskeia, the word we're using as an approximation for religion, I'll show you shortly how they had various notions within Thraiskeia, the idea of to what extent you should be superstitious, to what extent you should be fearful of the gods, and they thought there was a happy medium. So it was a bit of a spectrum. But the Pax Romana, I'm bringing that phrase up because for the Romans, Pax Romana just means Roman peace. And what I'm trying to use with this is that peace for the Romans wasn't one-dimensional concept. And it definitely wasn't a one-dimensional concept for the people who experienced Roman peace, because it was double-edged. So when you were under Pax Romana, peace had been made. So you got to benefit if you became absorbed into the empire or you were subjugated by the Roman legions. You got to, inverted commas, enjoy all the free trade, all the security provided for you by the Romans. So in that sense, you lived in peaceful times. Pax Romana was effective. But in order to obtain Pax Romana, it was forced upon you by the most powerful army in the world at the time. So it was both peaceful and the outcome of war and domination and absolute violence. So in Roman times, the point I'm trying to express is Pax, peace, wasn't the one-dimensional hippie type idea that we have. It was incredibly double-edged. It had its benefits, but my God, it had its costs. Or the benefits were paid for with the costs required for those benefits. So there's a dichotomous aspect to the notion of peace, just like we'll see now with the Goldilocks idea. Rather than a dichotomy, the Greeks had a sliding scale of just the right amount of religious sentiment. So threskeia is both, and this does have the dichotomy in it. It meant simultaneously superstition and religion, but depending on where on the scale you were, it was either manageable or it was too superstitious. So Daemonia, excessive fear of taboos. So daemonia is overcompensating and being too superstitious. Asabeia is not having enough fear. So you're being too blasé, you're not fearful enough of the gods. And Eusebeia is good fear, so that's the middle ground. So you can see how there's a whole spectrum there. Threskeia is the word used to basically give the overarching environment within which religious or superstitious beliefs were held. It's the word for the whole scale. And if you were excessively fearful, you're excessively superstitious, daemonia was the thing you suffered from. If you were too blasé, it was asabeia, and the Goldilocks point is eusebeia. But with both the Pax Romana idea and the Goldilocks idea of threskeia, they're not. Remember, the subtitle of the Boyarin book is about abstraction, the modern abstraction. These concepts are nuanced. These concepts are on a scale. They're not definitive quantitative amounts. And in our contemporary society, arguably, we actually have less of this nuance and more of the abstractions that are common in science, for example. So threskeia is used on the one hand by writers to indicate excessive, extravagant, and even harmfully distracting practices of others, but on the other hand can be used by participants to indicate their own cultic practices. It's as if a single word in Greek incorporates both our modern English religion and superstition, usually taken to be opposites. So this is the point I'm trying to express. Threskeia in Greek contains two opposing ideas depending on how it's used in a particular context. Pax Romana could be good or awful. Again, it contains within it an inherent ambivalence. And I just think lots of contemporary discourse lacks ambivalence or nuance. And we look back to ancient history thinking we're the more advanced people. But in terms of how they encountered the reality around themselves, there are interesting aspects to myth that are much more subtle than I think people from a modern perspective realise. Which begs the question, to what extent we're dependent on the Enlightenment, the scientific Enlightenment, but unbeknownst to us, we tend to treat it mythically as an, unquestioned truth that's just, come from the skies almost, because your average person has very little scientific knowledge, despite the fact our lives are absolutely dominated by it. So there is a certain irony that, as I'm going to explore, the Greeks didn't necessarily believe in their myths like we might like to think, but they found them very practically useful. We don't have any myths like the Greeks do, officially, but actually, for lots of people, science fills that. It's this weird thing that people don't fully understand. We use lots of daily technologies that, it's almost magical. We don't know how the inner workings of these things. In an abstract way, we know how electricity works and all these things, but on a practical basis, your average person has very little scientific or technological expertise. So they say cultures with elaborate divisions of labour and the developed hierarchical structures needed to coordinate and rationalise the activities of the participants in that culture often rely for unity on highly simplified covering ideas and symbols. It's exactly the abstraction that sacralises these ideas and sets them apart. So I'm just off the top of my head, if you think of the theory of relativity, E equals mc squared, it's almost like a magical, mythical incantation, because, most educated people know it, but there's very few people who actually understand it at any meaningful level. And yet we tend to think of science as this completely objective, non-mythical, non-magical thing. While all language relies on categories and abstractions, in complex cultures, particular prestige and faith is put not only in language over direct experience of the world, but particularly in the reification of deductively drawn abstractions, even over generalizations derived from observation of particulars. So I like this because it actually describes how the Faustian pact you make with science is that you glorify, in a way, they become, the maxims and formulas of science become almost like minor gods, gods with a small g, whereas science is the god with a big G. But this idea that deductively drawn abstractions become more important even over generalizations derived from observation of particulars. So in contemporary society, my favourite example would be bureaucracy. You could be a teacher, work at the universities, work in the civil servant service, or you could work, just say a hospital or whatever, and if you're on the coal face, so to speak, if you're at the front line of a complex organisation, you're a professional, your direct professional observation of what's going on is often subordinated to the generalised abstract process within which you're forced to work. And that's become incredibly normalised. And you get awkward people like me who've never ever liked it and always complain about it. But a lot of people just go along with bureaucracy, and bureaucracy creates these weird scenarios where the actual direct experience of professional people doesn't matter as much as what the process and the system needs. Where does all this lead? Well, you get to this, it's almost this Baudrillard, it's almost this Matrix type idea that it actually leads to We live in a world of the non-particular. We live in a world as described here. While scholars not accepting ourselves have the irresistible tendency as they read to use the literary work to symbolize and finally to replicate themselves, we have tried to the best of our ability not to let the scales of custom blind us to those aspects of the texts that are unfamiliar and difficult to comprehend. So the point being made here is this ideology of simulation. We have this urge to replicate ourselves, to see ourselves in the thing that we're looking at. I'm trying to give you a comparable example might be, it's the inherent contradiction of people who like to go travelling. They want to see the world, but actually they spend their time, most of their time, when they get wherever they're going, in Marriott hotels or comfortable hotels that are abstractions, to refer back to the previous slide. They're this generalized abstraction, this model of what a luxury hotel is or a decent hotel that supersedes the local particularities of the environment that you would be in if you had to go and stay at a, inverted commas, native hotel. So there's this weird disavowal goes on. People who purport to like traveling actually like to travel within a relatively simulated matrix-like environment of things they recognize. So that's a geographical, physical example. And what I'm saying is when people go back and look at texts like the Odyssey, what they tend to do is want to see themselves replicated in the thing they're looking at, rather than embrace the fact that what they're reading is unfamiliar and at times difficult to comprehend, and not recognize that the difficult to comprehend may be the point at which you can't go beyond. Why Esperanto failed. So these headings are mine. I'm just relating them to the Barton and Buyarin book. But this explanation, so this, they're quoting someone called J.Z. Smith. Explanation is at heart an act of translation, of redescription, a procedure where the unknown is reduced to the known by holding that a second-order conceptual language appropriate to one domain, the known, the familiar, may, with relative adequacy, translate the language appropriate to another domain, the unknown, the unfamiliar. So why I gave the subtitle Why Esperanto Failed is that Esperanto tries to reduce everything across cultures to a lowest common denominator, or at least a shared denominator. But what if the whole point about different human cultures is there's a certain indivisible remainder? There's a certain thing that is idiomatic, that cannot be fully translated or explained because it's unique to that culture. So there's the unknown is reduced to the known. That's what contemporary society always seeks to do. We seek to see ourselves in the past, when perhaps what we need to do is get a much fuller appreciation of how different we are to people who lived in the past. And that's nothing to panic over. That's something to actually be intrigued by and want to learn more about. So it would lead me to make this defense of confusion and enigma. Maybe that's self-serving, because if I confuse everyone, I can claim that's a good thing. We grant emphatically that the understanding of one human by another is dependent on the possibility of translation. But the question remains of how far one can reduce the unknown to the known before one loses the irreducible difference of the unknown. So that's the point I was making about idiomatic expressions in different languages. You can never give a precise translation because that's why they're idiomatic. They're untranslatable. But what tends to happen is the Marriott hotel chain is the example I'm using. You're trying to reduce the unknowability of, you don't know what a local hotel will be like, so you want in advance to know the exact type of experience you're going to be having in the hotel that you're staying in whilst you're traveling in order to seek new experiences. So our culture doesn't particularly privilege genuinely different experiences. We translate Western comfort onto areas of the world that we claim to want to see in their authenticity, when we're undermining it from the very start by wanting to stay in a Western style hotel. So much is systematically occluded when the categories of analysis that are mobilized are not produced inductively, but simply deployed without being subject to constant revision in the face of the words and categories of the cultures being studied. We are hoping in this work to do the impossible work of making an incommensurable thought world comprehensible without resorting to the pre-sorted categories produced in the scholar's study. So the idea, what they're arguing is that you need to immerse yourself in either the foreign country or, in this case, something like the Odyssey, and to stop trying to translate with categories or concepts that are from your time and your culture. So you obviously need to translate enough of it to be able to make sense of it, but you need to be open to the idea that the sense that's made isn't fully making sense, if that makes sense. You need to realize that there will be elements that are not fully understandable. And then, so that's the enigma from the previous slide. It's like when I've shown Giorgio de Chirico paintings on this channel. The Enigma of the Hour was one of them. And why de Chirico is such a wonderful artist is that he does what I'm asking people to do with literature. He embraces the enigmatic. He's not scared at all to produce something that you're not quite sure what he's doing. And isn't that true of most great art? If you could fully describe your experience of looking at great visual art, well, it wouldn't be great visual art because nothing would be left to the imagination. You'd be able to describe and translate the experience in full. So the very thing that makes art great, the thing that can't be put into words, would be the thing you think you're doing. So they're advocating, Barton and Boyarin, that we avoid pre-sorted categories. So when Athena comes to speak to Telemachus, it's a god with a small g. It's not God with a big G. It's not a monotheistic God. And that, for most people of today, it's an alien concept that gods come to Earth and interfere in human affairs. It's less confusing if you interpret it more psychologically. But when I say you need to, or it could be interpreted more psychologically, I'm not claiming that exhausts or provides a full explanation. I'm suggesting that in an enigmatic, ambiguous way, remember one of those early quotes about the muses produce aletheia, which is truth, but they also introduce deception. So the myths, the way the Greeks used them, are able to convey certain psychological truths or conditions, but not with complete accuracy. So we could learn from them whilst recognizing that A, they're not perfect, and B, they don't fully map on to modern times either, because we're different species of people now, effectively, because there's such huge passages of history have gone by. So it's getting this Goldilocks again idea of not interpreting works like the Odyssey too much with modern Western notions, but then not seeing them as completely alien either. It's trying to rather embrace the enigma, embrace the ambiguity, and get something from it. So I'll start rounding up, but the idea, beware Greeks bearing metaphors, if not wooden horses, but translating the act of cultural translation into metaphor. So this is how convoluted it gets, I'm suggesting. I'll give you a practical example. There's the idea of the Chinese cookbook, and then there's the idea of the jigsaw. So the Chinese cookbook, I'll give you the specifics in a second, but it's like being given a Chinese cookbook in Mandarin, for example, whereby it's ideogrammatic, it's in Chinese script. And every time you come across an ingredient you're not sure of, it's as if someone said, well, you just use the word food. Well, that doesn't help you make a recipe if every element is just called generically food. And what Barton and Boyarin are saying is, if you're trying to understand what religion was like in ancient times, if you're trying to understand how the Odyssey works in its cultural, what it's describing in the Odyssey, the culture of ancient Greece, if when the gods Athena comes to see Telemachus, if you think of that as an expression of religion, that's like using the word food for all these very specific Chinese ingredients. It's too generic. Or the other example is the jigsaw. The idea with the jigsaw analogy is that without the box lid, imagine trying to do a jigsaw without the picture on the box. It would be very, very difficult. But the danger is that if you have a picture like the word religion, if the picture makes you put the jigsaw together in a certain way, then you've been led by the picture. So if you've got a concept like religion, you treat that like the box lid of a jigsaw. It makes you see there is only one solution, when that may not be. The jigsaw may be without an actual picture. The jigsaw may not be solvable. We can only approximate, but we're given this false sense that it can be solved because we have these all-inclusive terms like religion. So this is the Chinese cookbook analogy. Many readers may feel that religion provides a perfectly comprehensible English translation of religio or threskeia, even while not conveying the nuances of the ancient context. But the perfectly comprehensible English translation often occludes the interesting or pertinent differences between our concepts and the Latin or Greek. It's as if someone wanting to understand Chinese culture is given a Chinese cookbook. We suggest that translating religion and threskeia as religio, gives us about as much information about Roman and Hellenistic cultures as food used to translate the ingredients in a Chinese cookbook gives us about Chinese cuisines. The jigsaw lid is reinforcing this point. The abstract category religion most certainly allows the scholar to search for, arrange, and compare a pre-selected set of cultural characteristics. But it is in the way that the picture on the cover of a jigsaw puzzle facilitates the search for, comparison, and fitting together of 1,000 separate pieces. But the picture also predetermines what one will look for and find in the pieces. So sorry. That was the point I made previously. It's the idea that you're led, your interpretation is overdetermined by the concepts you've chosen, but the concepts themselves give you a false picture of, for example, what religion was like. in ancient Greece. So I'll finish on this quotation here. Wittgenstein said that uttering a word is like striking a note on the keyboard of the imagination. If, as he also remarked, to imagine a language is to imagine a form of life, our task now is to imagine the form of life that attended the language of the ancient Romans and Greeks, to accept their languages with their own aggregations and disaggregations, paradoxes and obfuscations, and thus to imagine no religion. I love that phrase. Uttering a word is like striking a note on the keyboard of the imagination. But they're using Wittgenstein to underline the point that's been made throughout this talk, the idea that uttering a word is like striking a note on the keyboard of the imagination. The trick is, again, it's like the Goldilocks of music. You want the keyboard of the imagination. You want to play a good tune. But you don't want the tune to be absolutely predetermined by the concept you've chosen or the words that you've chosen. You want some freedom to be able to invent a good tune rather than have this rigid, preordained tune because you've chosen a concept that leads you to think in a certain way, when in fact the past was much more complex than that. Well, I hope that was of some interest, and why I hope it's helped with. I wanted to present all this so that I could convey, as I keep reading the actual sections of the text. So I'll start in a few days. I'll do part 2 of book 1, and then I'll try and build up some momentum and do more readings of the actual text. But I just thought when I began to read about, in the actual text, Athena visiting Telemachus, that you could proceed to read the first 4 books of the experience of Telemachus and not understand or appreciate the role played or the significance of being visited by Athena and what does that actually mean. And I think my experience is that when you read books about the Odyssey, they don't delve too deeply into what are the unique characteristics of a world in which the story was you would be visited by a god with a small g. And actually, I just think it's really interesting to put ourselves in the place of a people who understood their world and were able, through telling themselves stories about gods, actually managed to convey. So in the example I gave with Athena and Telemachus, she's encouraging him to use his intuition. She's encouraging him to develop into manhood. So she is a poetic version of what Telemachus needs to do to grow into maturity. So the Greeks have managed to find, in a much more sophisticated way than you could gain from reading the diagnostic and statistical manual that the psychiatric profession uses in the States and across the Western world. They're finding really organic ways through myth and through epics like the Odyssey. They're finding ways to actually express really profound human truths in a literary form. And that's what intrigues me about the Odyssey, especially, is that it's so much about human characteristics and human psychology in a way that's simultaneously foreign to modern people. It's alien and enigmatic, but also approachable. And it's that tension between the approachability and the alien that needs to be kept in some type of balance, this Goldilocks point. But hopefully that's helped you at least appreciate, not put you off, the Odyssey as we continue with the epic tale. So all the very best until the next time. Take care.